Imagine a family legend so specific it names an exact empire, an exact king, and an exact century, repeated at the dinner table for generation after generation. And then imagine a geneticist, decades later, running a completely independent calculation on that same family's DNA, with no knowledge of the legend at all, and watching the numbers land almost exactly where the story said they would. That is not a hypothetical. In Beverly Hills, a few blocks east of Rodeo Drive, a 60,000 square foot temple holds services for a congregation that traces its own founding not to 1980, when the building went up, but to a royal decree issued roughly 2,500 years earlier by a Persian king who had never heard of Los Angeles. Today, somewhere between 60 and 80,000 Iranian Jews live in the United States, most in this same stretch of the West Side and in Great Neck, New York, carrying a tradition that claims to run in an unbroken line back to the Persian Empire itself. What makes this story different from most family legends is that geneticists actually went looking for a way to check it, not against tradition, but against a mathematical clock buried in the genome itself, one that does not care what any legend claims, and simply reports what centuries of marriage patterns actually did to a population's DNA. Stay with this to the very end, because the number that clock produced is far more precise and far stranger in what it implies than most people expecting a simple ancestry answer are prepared for. The question is not whether Jews have a long history connected to Persia. That part is well documented and goes back to the Babylonian exile itself. The real question is narrower and more testable. Is the 2,500-year figure that Persian Jewish tradition repeats simply a round, symbolic number attached to a religious story, the kind every old community eventually accumulates, or does it correspond to something a geneticist could actually independently calculate from DNA alone, without ever being told the history first? For most communities, that kind of claim stays a matter of faith, because the tools to check it did not exist until genome-wide analysis matured enough to estimate population split times with real precision. For Persian Jews specifically, that check has now been run, and the tease worth sitting with is this. The number that came back was not vague. It landed inside a specific range, and that range happens to point straight at one particular empire's rise. The first explanation is the simplest, that Persian Jews are, genetically speaking, just ordinary Iranians who happen to practice a different religion, with no distinct ancestry underneath the label. Genome-wide testing runs directly against that. When researchers compared Iranian Jewish samples to their non-Jewish Iranian neighbors, the two groups formed separate, statistically distinct clusters, not a single blended population, despite living in the same cities, trading in the same markets, and speaking the same everyday language for thousands of years. The second explanation treats the 2,500-year figure as unfalsifiable religious tradition, a nice round number no different from any other community's founding myth, impossible to actually check against anything outside the tradition itself. That assumption held for most of history simply because the tools did not exist. It stopped holding once genome-wide population genetics matured enough to estimate, from DNA alone, roughly how many generations separate two populations that once shared a common ancestor, turning a religious claim into something closer to a testable hypothesis. The third explanation leans entirely on the Book of Esther, treating the biblical story of a Jewish queen saving her people at the Persian court as the whole and complete origin story. It is a beloved narrative, but even the physical site most associated with it, a domed tomb in Hamadan traditionally linked to Esther and her uncle Mordecai, is contested by historians. One prominent theory holds it may actually belong to an entirely different, later Jewish noblewoman connected to the Sasanian royal court instead, centuries after Esther's story is supposed to have taken place. The fourth explanation assumes all Jewish communities are genetically interchangeable, so a video about Persian Jews specifically would have nothing new to say. Genome-wide comparisons say otherwise directly. Persian and Iraqi Jewish populations carry measurably less European ancestry than Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Italian, or Syrian Jewish populations do, a real quantifiable genetic difference between Jewish communities, not just a difference in geography, language, or custom. That single contrast is worth remembering, because the rest of this video builds directly on top of it. The real setup starts with a name most casual history misses entirely: Cyrus the Great. In 539 before the Common Era, Cyrus's Persian army took Babylon and, within about 30 years, had replaced the entire Babylonian Empire with his own. According to Jewish tradition and a genuine surviving artifact known as the Cyrus Cylinder, now held in the British Museum, Cyrus issued a policy allowing exiled peoples under his new empire to return home and rebuild their temples. Jewish exiles taken to Babylon roughly 2 generations earlier were among the peoples covered by that policy, and the Second Temple in Jerusalem was completed by 516 before the Common Era. Not everyone went back. A substantial Jewish population stayed inside Persian territory, in Babylon and in Persia proper, and that population is the one this video is actually about. That much is well-established history. What stayed unresolved for a very long time was whether the population that stayed behind actually kept a continuous, largely unbroken lineage for the next 2,500 years, or whether so much local intermarriage happened along the way that any distinct genetic signal would have been diluted past detection. That took a 2010 genome-wide study, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics under the title Abraham's Children in the Genome Era, led by researchers including Gil Atzmon and Harry Oster. The team analyzed genome-wide markers across 7 Jewish diaspora populations: Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, Italian, Turkish, Greek, and Ashkenazi, comparing each against non-Jewish reference populations from the same regions. The method, in plain terms, treats the genome like a clock that runs at a roughly predictable rate. The more generations since 2 populations split from a shared ancestor, the more small genetic differences accumulate between them, in a way statisticians can convert back into an estimated number of generations. Researchers describe being struck by how consistently every one of the 7 Jewish groups formed its own distinct genetic cluster, while still sitting closer to each other than to the non-Jewish populations they had lived beside for centuries. Here is where the Iranian data specifically got interesting, because when the team ran the clock backward on the split between Middle Eastern Jewish populations and Jewish populations that had settled in Europe, the number that came out was not vague at all. Start with the story every Persian Jewish family already knows, told every year at Purim. A Jewish woman named Esther becomes queen of Persia and saves her people from destruction, at the court of a king most historians associate with Xerxes I, in the ancient city of Susa, called Shushan in Hebrew. It is one of the most vivid survival stories in the entire Jewish tradition, dramatic, specific, and centered on real Persian geography. On its own, a beloved story is not proof of anything historically precise, and the surprising side fact here cuts both ways at once. The traditional burial site associated with Esther and Mordecai, a domed mausoleum in the Iranian city of Hamadan, is only documented as being identified with them starting around the 12th century of the Common Era, more than 1,500 years after the events the story describes. One respected theory, proposed by the German Jewish archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld, argues the tomb may not hold Esther and Mordecai at all, but rather a different Jewish woman entirely, Shushan-Ducht, daughter of a Jewish exilarch, wife of the Sasanian king Yazdegerd I, and mother of King Bahram V, credited in some accounts with helping establish a Jewish community in the city of Isfahan. Picture the mausoleum itself, its brick dome rising over a quiet residential street in modern Hamadan, pilgrims still visiting every Purim to read the Book of Esther aloud inside it, regardless of which specific queen actually lies beneath the floor. 2 numbers worth holding here. One story, set in the 5th century before the Common Era, against a physical tomb tradition that cannot be documented earlier than the 12th century after it, a gap of well over 1,000 years. Legend alone, however beloved, was never going to settle this on its own. Something closer to a genuine, dated physical object, checkable by anyone regardless of faith, was needed instead. That object exists, and unlike the Hamadan tomb, its age is not in serious dispute. The Cyrus cylinder is a clay artifact inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, commissioned after Cyrus the Great's conquest of Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, describing his policy of restoring displaced peoples and their temples. It was excavated in 1879 and has sat in the British Museum ever since, examined and re-examined by generations of historians and linguists. The reveal is that this is independent, non-biblical, non-Jewish confirmation that a real Persian policy of this general kind existed at roughly the right moment. A conquering king explicitly describing the return and restoration of exiled peoples under his new rule. The surprising side fact is what the cylinder does not say. It never mentions Jews or Jerusalem specifically by name, which is exactly why some historians urge caution about treating it as a direct, one-to-one archaeological proof of the biblical account in the Book of Ezra, even though the general policy it documents fits the biblical narrative closely enough that most scholars treat the two as describing the same broad historical moment. Picture the cylinder itself, barely the size of a rugby ball, dense cuneiform script wrapped around its curved surface, sitting behind museum glass in London, physically present in a way no oral tradition ever can be. Two numbers side by side, zero explicit mentions of Jerusalem on the object itself, against one extremely specific and well-documented royal policy of religious restoration issued in exactly the years Jewish tradition says the exile started ending. Cyrus's own words, or something extremely close to them, had survived in clay for well over 2,000 years before anyone dug it up again. What they could not do was tell us what actually happened, generation after generation, to the Jewish families who chose to stay in Persia instead of going home. Those families are the ones this story actually follows, and the historical record on them, while less dramatic than a queen's rescue or a king's decree, is unusually specific about timing. Jewish communities in Babylon and in Persia proper are documented as forming and stabilizing across roughly the 6th through 4th centuries before the Common Era, spanning the transition from Babylonian to Persian to, eventually, later Iranian rule, with Jewish populations remaining continuously present through every change of empire in between. The reveal is continuity across multiple unrelated political upheavals, which matters more than it might first sound. A population that simply happened to be in the right place during one specific king's reign is a coincidence. A population still documented in the same general region under at least 3 or 4 completely different ruling powers over close to 1,000 years is something closer to a settled, self-sustaining community with its own internal structure, not a temporary diaspora waiting to go home. The surprising side fact is how this plain historical record eventually became directly checkable against genetic data, something almost no ancient population's history normally allows. Because the Iranian and Iraqi Jewish communities being discussed in the historical sources are, with reasonable confidence, the same population lines still identifiable and testable today, researchers were not working from a cold trail, they were working from a community that never fully stopped existing in roughly the same place. Two numbers worth holding: 3 or 4 separate ruling empires, Babylonian, Persian, and their various successors, against one continuously documented Jewish population sitting underneath all of them. Historical record had done what legend and a single artifact could not do on their own. It had drawn a continuous line across nearly 1,000 years and 3 or 4 separate empires. What it could not yet do was measure exactly how close that line had actually stayed to outside marriage the entire time. That measurement came from an unusual place. Not a history department, but a statistical technique for estimating how closely related people within the same population actually are to each other, on average, at the level of shared DNA segments. The 2010 genome-wide study found that individuals within each of the 7 Jewish groups analyzed, Iranian included, shared roughly as much genome in common with other members of their own group as ordinary 4th or 5th cousins would, a level of relatedness far higher than you would expect in a large, freely mixing national population. The reveal is specific and a little startling. Among the 7 groups studied, Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, and Italian Jews came out as the most closely related internally, the most consistently married within the community, of all the populations tested. That is a directly measurable, quantifiable form of evidence for exactly the kind of long-term religious and cultural endogamy that Persian Jewish tradition has always claimed about itself, just expressed now as a statistic rather than a story. The surprising side fact is why this particular form of evidence matters so much for the split-time question that follows it. A population that keeps marrying within itself generation after generation is precisely the kind of population whose genome preserves an old split cleanly, without a slow trickle of outside ancestry blurring the calculation. Picture the practical shape of that pattern across roughly 2,500 years. A community large enough to sustain itself, small and closed enough that a random 2 members are about as related as cousins, repeated across dozens of generations in a row. 2 numbers worth sitting with: 4th or 5th cousin-level relatedness within the group, against the much more distant relatedness you would expect between 2 random members of a large, open national population. The closed nature of the community was not just cultural memory. It was sitting directly inside the mathematics of the genome, waiting for someone to run the calculation forward to its logical conclusion. Running that calculation forward required one more comparison, and this is where Iranian Jews specifically start to look different, even from many of their fellow diaspora Jewish communities. The same 2010 study found that Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Italian, and Syrian Jewish populations each carry substantial European ancestry, somewhere in the range of 30 to 60% of their total genome, picked up through centuries of residence and some degree of intermarriage in European territories. Iranian and Iraqi Jews did not show that same pattern. Their genomes carry markedly less European admixture than the other diaspora groups studied, sitting instead much closer, proportionally, to non-Jewish Middle Eastern reference populations, while still remaining clearly distinct from their immediate non-Jewish Iranian and Iraqi neighbors specifically. The reveal is a genuine fork in Jewish diaspora history. Visible directly in the genome, communities that eventually settled in Europe picked up a real, substantial, measurable amount of European ancestry over the centuries, while communities that stayed in the Middle East, Iranian and Iraqi Jews specifically, largely did not, keeping something much closer to their original Middle Eastern genetic proportions. The surprising side fact is that this is not simply a story about geography. It is a story about which societies allowed a minority to stay reproductively separate for 2,500 years, and which ones, through persecution, expulsion, forced conversion, or simple long-term proximity, eventually did not. Two numbers worth holding together: 30 to 60% European ancestry in Ashkenazi and related communities, against a figure for Iranian and Iraqi Jews low enough that researchers describe them as sitting proportionally much closer to the Middle East than any of the European settled Jewish diaspora groups do. The contrast itself was the clue, sitting there in the data for anyone willing to compare the two sets of numbers side by side. The precise number behind it, the one that would actually date the split, was still one calculation away. That calculation is the split time estimate itself, and it is the single strongest piece of evidence in this entire story. Using genome-wide data and the accumulated small genetic differences between Middle Eastern Jewish populations, Iranian and Iraqi specifically, and Jewish populations that had settled in Europe, researchers calculated a divergence time of roughly 100 to 150 generations since the two branches shared a common ancestral population. The reveal is what that range converts to in ordinary years, and how precisely it lines up with independent history. At a standard estimate of roughly 20 to 25 years per generation, 100 to 150 generations works out to somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,750 years, a range the researchers themselves describe as compatible with a historical divide reported to have occurred more than 2,500 years ago. That is not a vague, rounded estimate stretching to fit the tradition. It is a mathematically independent calculation, run without reference to any religious text, landing inside the same historical window the Babylonian exile and Cyrus's decree actually occupy. The surprising side fact is how rare this kind of alignment actually is in population genetics. Most ancient community origin stories, when checked this way, either cannot be tested with this level of precision at all, or the genetic estimate ends up contradicting the traditional date significantly. Picture the actual moment a researcher sees this number resolve on a computer screen, a statistical range calculated from hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, and watching it land almost exactly on top of a date every Persian Jewish family already knew from their own religious calendar. Two numbers, finally matching instead of merely close, roughly 100 to 150 generations calculated from DNA alone, against more than 2,500 years claimed independently by history and tradition. Every earlier clue, the legend, the cylinder, the historical record, the endogamy statistics, the admixture contrast, had been circling this exact number. This is the calculation that finally pinned it down. Line the evidence up and it narrows toward one of the cleanest matches in this entire genre of story. Legend placed the origin at the Persian court under a specific king. A surviving clay cylinder confirmed the general policy that made staying or returning possible in the first place. Historical record traced a continuously documented community across 3 or 4 different empires. Endogamy statistics showed a population that consistently married within itself for that entire stretch. Admixture comparison showed that population keeping a comparatively undiluted Middle Eastern genetic signal, while European settled Jewish communities picked up 30 to 60% outside ancestry. And the final split time calculation landed the whole story inside a window of 100 to 150 generations, converting to right around 2,500 years. The data had stopped approximating. It had converged on a number. Here is what the DNA actually shows, without hedging. Persian Jews carry a genome-wide signature indicating their ancestors split from the ancestors of European settled Jewish communities, roughly 100 to 150 generations ago, a figure that converts to somewhere around 2,500 years, independently matching the historical window of the Babylonian exile and the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Their genome also carries markedly less European admixture than Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Italian, or Syrian Jewish populations, evidence of a population that remained reproductively close to the Middle East, rather than picking up substantial outside ancestry over the centuries. This is not simply a case of ancient Middle Eastern ancestry in general, the kind of broad claim that could describe almost any Middle Eastern Jewish community. It is a genetic record that lines up, independently and with real statistical precision, against one of the most specific and well-documented political events in ancient history, calculated by researchers who started from the genome alone and only afterward checked it against the calendar. But the real twist here is not the precision of that date match. A number lining up with history is impressive, but it is, in a sense, the expected best-case outcome once you already know the tradition and go looking to test it. The genuinely strange part is the mechanism underneath the number. Why did Iranian and Iraqi Jews keep such a comparatively undiluted signal for 2,500 years, while Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, descended from populations that likely started out just as Middle Eastern, ended up 30 to 60% European instead? The easy assumption is that Persian Jews simply lived more isolated lives, tucked away from other populations. That is not really what the historical record shows. Jewish communities in Persia and later Iran lived embedded inside major cities, trading, working, and interacting daily with their non-Jewish neighbors for well over 2,000 years, under Achaemenid, Parthian, Sasanian, and eventually Islamic rule. They were never physically sealed off the way isolation is usually pictured. What they experienced instead was a very different, more specific kind of boundary. Centuries of formal minority status, first under Persian religious tolerance that permitted separate communal life, later under Islamic-era dhimmi status that legally recognized Jews as a distinct protected community, permitted to practice their own religion and law, but expected to remain socially and maritally separate from the Muslim majority around them. That is a boundary enforced from both directions at once, by the community's own religious law and by the surrounding society's legal category for it, sustained continuously for 2,500 years. Compare that to the experience of Jewish communities that eventually settled across Christian Europe, where recurring expulsions, forced conversions, and periods of extreme persecution created exactly the kind of chaotic, boundary-breaking pressure that produces intermarriage and admixture even when it was never officially sanctioned. The twist is this. The cleanliness of the Persian Jewish genetic signal is not really a story about isolation at all. It is a genetic record of which societies maintained a stable, if unequal, boundary around a minority for 2,500 years, and which societies repeatedly shattered that boundary through violence instead. If that reframing is correct, an entirely different category of evidence, medical rather than ancestral, should show the same underlying pattern, and it does. For nearly 3 centuries, right up until the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Persian Jewish communities remained almost completely reproductively closed, marrying within an unusually tight internal network, even by the already endogamous standards, documented across the wider Jewish diaspora. A 2010 pilot study published in the journal Genetics in Medicine, titled Genetic Screening in the Persian Jewish Community, documented several relatively frequent inherited disorders traced to specific founder mutations within this population. Genetic variants that became unusually common not because they conferred any advantage, but simply because a small number of original carriers passed them down repeatedly within a community that kept marrying inside itself for generation after generation. This is independent confirmation in the clearest possible sense. It did not come from ancestry statisticians studying population clustering on a computer. It came from clinicians treating actual patients in actual clinics and gradually noticing recurring, traceable genetic conditions clustering specifically within Persian Jewish families, long before anyone connected that pattern back to a 2,500-year-old empire. Picture a genetic counselor today reviewing a Persian Jewish couple's family history before pregnancy, running a targeted panel for exactly the founder mutations this 2010 study cataloged, a direct, present-day medical consequence of marriage patterns that trace back centuries before either partner's grandparents were born. 2 completely different medical and genealogical fields, working from completely different kinds of data, converged on the identical underlying story, a population that stayed unusually close to outside marriage, for an extraordinarily long stretch of history, right up until a political revolution finally scattered much of it across the world within a single generation. The mechanism behind both findings, the clean ancestral signal and the concentrated inherited disorders, is the same founder effect and long-term endogamy pattern seen elsewhere in this kind of story. But the numbers here reflect an unusually long, unusually stable run of closed community marriage rather than a short, sharp population bottleneck. 2,500 years of predominantly internal marriage, sustained across at least 4 major changes of ruling empire, is enough time for both effects to compound heavily in the same direction, generation stacked on generation, with almost no outside input to dilute either one. The numbers make the trade-off visible. On one side, nearly 3 centuries of especially tight reproductive isolation before 1979 produced specific, identifiable founder mutation disorders significant enough to justify a dedicated clinical screening study. On the other side, that same multi-century pattern of internal marriage is precisely why the population's ancestral genetic signal stayed clean enough for researchers to calculate a split-time estimate landing inside a historically meaningful window in the first place, rather than blurring into statistical noise the way a less consistently endogamous population signal eventually would. It is one mechanism producing 2 very different kinds of evidence: a medical cost, measured in specific inherited conditions that clinicians still screen for today, and a historical benefit, measured in a genetic clock precise enough to corroborate a 2,500-year-old empire's decree. Neither one exists without the other, and neither would be detectable at all in a population that had simply intermarried freely with its neighbors along the way. Both trace back to the exact same closed marriage pattern, repeated across roughly 100 generations in an almost unbroken row. None of this proves that Esther and Mordecai were literally real historical individuals, or that the tomb in Hamadan holds either of them rather than the alternative candidate some historians propose. The 100 to 150 generation split estimate is a statistical range with real uncertainty attached, not an exact calendar year, and generation length assumptions used to convert it into calendar years carry their own margin of error. It does not rule out some degree of later admixture events that simply did not register strongly enough to shift the overall pattern. What the evidence solidly supports is a genuine, ancient, comparatively undiluted Middle Eastern Jewish lineage, with a split-time estimate that plausibly overlaps the historical window it claims, calculated independently rather than assumed from tradition. What it cannot supply is a single, exact, undisputed year, and anyone who tells you it does is rounding off real uncertainty for the sake of a cleaner story. Think about your own sense of how far back your family's story actually reaches with any confidence. Most of us run out of verified names within a few generations, then switch to vague description, somewhere from Europe, sometime before a war, and the trail effectively ends there. Not because nothing happened before that, but because nobody kept a usable record, and nothing in our own biology was ever going to hand us a second one. Persian Jewish families got something almost no other community gets: an independent, mathematical second opinion on their own oldest story. One that did not simply agree out of politeness, but landed inside the same specific centuries their tradition had been claiming all along. Arrived at by researchers who were not trying to prove anything, only to measure it. That is not a small thing. Most traditions this old never get checked this precisely, and most of the ones that do get checked this way do not survive the comparison nearly this well. The Cyrus cylinder said the policy that mattered was real. The historical record said a community stayed put across 4 empires afterward. The endogamy statistics said that community kept marrying within itself the entire time. The admixture comparison said it kept its Middle Eastern signal, while European communities did not. The split time calculation said all of that adds up to somewhere around 2,500 years, independently, from DNA alone. Persian Jews really do carry a genetic story that goes back thousands of years, and for once, the thousands of years part is not an exaggeration, it is closer to a measurement. If your own family has a story this old that you have never been able to check against anything, tell it in the comments. Somebody watching this might know exactly where to start looking.